Apartheid was a white welfare state. It was distressing to me.
Wow.
How little people who were hoping to kind of win the elections had thought about the economy at all. But we're heading towards a situation where half of all adults are not employed. And that's the point, is you don't have to teach poor people how to make money. It's just you need to enable them.
Isobel Frye, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX. We're very glad to welcome you.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for the invitation.
We're going to be speaking about this important proposal of a basic income guarantee, or even a universal basic income guarantee. But to set the scene, we hear about poverty a lot, and it's this abstract concept often in policy debates. What is the nature and what is the depth of poverty in South Africa at the moment, and how has that been changing? Are things getting better or worse over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental question to trying to find solutions and a future trajectory that we need to have. So the poverty levels in South Africa really are dire. We're an upper middle income country, if you look at per capita income, and yet because of the inequality, we find that the majority of people live in conditions that are akin to highly indebted countries on a global level. And then we have a very small elite whose lifestyles have continued to get better and better. I think that, I was just looking at an income distribution last night, and again, that the richest 10%, the richest income decile, have significantly more access to income than anybody else. So the curve is basically flat for the first 7 income deciles, and the highest income decile has 2/3 more than the 8th income decile. So the patterns, the levels of poverty continue to be reinforced. And part of that is, if you look at questions of income sourcing, and we'll look at that. But I think that it's important to recognize that as the most unequal country with the highest unemployment rate in the world, the conditions that prevail in South Africa are not sustainable. And that's something that leadership needs to really embrace, is we need to find radical solutions, because the depth of the problem is just so structural. And that's the unemployment as well as the income and wealth distribution.
And one of the key attempts to at least make a start at addressing that in terms of ANC policy has been creating forms of social security. We have various grants that already exist in South Africa. Can you take us through what exists already before we get on to why you think we need to expand that beyond where we are?
Absolutely. But I'm going to take a step back, just talk about social security. I love social security. Sure. I love the concept. And I have to declare this, I love the concept of a welfare state. And I think that I'm often caught up in binary arguments about welfare versus developmental states. I think that the welfare state is the most developmental state in terms of state structure and state policy. So, if you look at the well-known welfare states that were developed in Western Europe after the Second World War, we look traditionally at 5 pillars. The Beveridge report in the UK looked at housing, education, healthcare, work, and income.
Right.
Those are like the 5 aspects that make a healthy society when those are all ticked. Then you go to the 60s and you have the UN coming up with the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and various other instruments that recognize the importance of social security as a basic income. And the reason that we all need basic income is that we all have needs and wants, but it's also a fundamental economic stabilizer. So if you look at a country like South Africa, where you have elite capture of a significant part of the income distribution, it means that the majority of people are not active economic citizens, neither giving nor demanding. And when you don't have demand, you have a breakdown in the flow of the economy. So social security for me is both a guarantee of economic well-being as well as individual, household, and community well-being. Now, in Western Europe, industrialized societies, the income distribution guarantee was based on full employment. So as working people, you contribute, and that gets drawn down on when you're an old age pensioner. And in many societies, when children come into a household, there's a universal child grant, recognizing that there are additional income needs and children don't earn. So the idea is that there is a free supply of income throughout, from the cradle to the grave. South Africa, the social security that we have is actually inherited from the apartheid state. So you can imagine immediately how this doesn't fit. I must also just say that social security as a concept has two legs. It has the social insurance, where you contribute, and social assistance, which is tax funded. So for us in South Africa, one of the social insurance funds that we have is unemployment insurance, for instance, the Road Accident Fund and COIDA, Compensation for Occupational Injury and Diseases Act. And then we have the tax-funded social assistance. So this was developed in last century, sort of from about the 50s, where the household that was considered from a policy perspective was the white household with a white male breadwinner and basically guaranteed employment because of job reservation. So the only time that the white male breadwinner was not going to be earning, it was assumed would be for a period of about 6 months. And so the Unemployment Insurance Fund provided income replacement for a 6-month period. Initially it was 4 and sort of expanded. And then you had social assistance for poor children and poor old age pensioners. But you also had a significant role played by the private sector coming in and providing private pension funds. So sort of sector specific pension funds. And the state had they regulated, but there was no replacement level state pension. And as you know, the majority of South Africans, many millions of people had their citizenship taken away through the Bantustan section sort of policy. And so after 1994, the question is what to do with social security. In 1996, an act came into being in order to regulate social assistance, which is what I'm going to be talking about, the social assistance side. But that act was actually a 1992 act.
Wow.
So until 2004, the social assistance kind of structure in South Africa was premised on an apartheid law, despite the fact that the Constitution of South Africa guarantees the right of social security to everybody, including social assistance.
Section 27.
So, Section 27(1)(c). And so you have, from the beginning, there is a lack of fit between what is required and what exists.
That's fascinating. I mean, before we get into, I didn't realize that because the narrative of social security in South Africa is that, well, the ANC came in and then realized that, we needed this welfare state and then implemented a kind of very radically new policy. But it's fascinating to hear that the history, at least the structure of that policy and its philosophy, is actually inherited.
Apartheid was a white welfare state, and it looked after whites on a level akin to a kind of continental European welfare, so not quite the British system of welfare, liberal welfare. So then, after 1994, you have the reincorporation of all parts of South Africa, and you have a significant level of poverty that exists. Now, again, under migrant labor and apartheid, women and children were designated to rural Bantustans, and men were brought in as migrant workers for their labor at sort of survivalist wages for the men, because the narrative there was that women were subsistence farmers. So we've never had accumulation of income at any significant level for the majority of people in South Africa. I think just to conclude your question that was asked a long time ago, so the social assistance categories that we have are all social assistance is means tested, so it's sort of poverty targeted, to use a World Bank phrase. And so children under the age of 18, the Constitution defines a child as someone under the age of 18. So from 0 to 18, there is a child support grant.
Right.
And from 60 onwards, you have an old age pension. And then you've got disability grants and a few other war veterans grants. So the child support grant amounts to 530 Rand per child per month. You have a child, you know how much it costs to raise a child. And the old age pension is more, that's 2,300.
Right.
And the idea initially was that the old age pension and the child support grant themselves should be sufficient to keep poor households ticking over. And the big question has always been, what do you do with working age, poor, unemployed people? And that's really where ideology comes in.
Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. Very interesting. Let's get to the proposal then now, which is basic income guarantee, but over time, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, a universal basic income guarantee. What is the demand there from SPY, also from this coalition of civil society organizations that's been working on this for many years? What do you think government should do to tackle this poverty, tackle this inequality through this form of income relief?
You're right, it has been going on for a long time. In 1998, there was a presidential job summit under President Mandela, and at that stage, COSATU was looking forward and was sort of looking to the future and anticipated the fact that unemployment was not going to fall. And so they called for a number of initiatives to provide for workers. And one of them was the establishment of a committee, so it's ministerially appointed rather than presidentially appointed, a committee of inquiry into comprehensive social security, which is known as the Taylor Committee under the chair of Vivian Taylor.
Okay.
And in 2002, the committee released their report, which recommended the introduction of a national social security fund, which would not absorb existing pensions, but would sort of for future orientation provide pensions. There would be a national insurance contribution from workers, and for those people who weren't working, there would be the basic income grant. So that goes back to 2002, and the economics behind that at that point in time was that it would be 100 Rand per person per month, and that would close the poverty gap by about 74%.
Wow.
And I was part of a coalition back then. I was working at Black Sash, and COSATU and the Council of Churches were sort of the other main bodies. And we were very keen about making sure that this had traction. But the ruling party, the ANC, was completely opposed to it. We struggled to even have the opportunity to have it interrogated in Parliament, and the chair of the Portfolio Committee on Social Development, Cass Saluji, agreed eventually, but on a Friday afternoon when most of the members would have been on the aeroplanes going back. I mean, that's how, that's with the level of distancing that existed around the proposal. And I spoke to then Minister of Social Development, Zola Skweyiya, who was amazing, and said to him, but given the sort of given the liberation of the ANC, how come this is not seen as creating freedom and emancipation? And he said, you've got to remember that in our dreams, our children were going to become accountants and doctors, not be grant recipients. And so it's that distance between the ideal and reality. And but he also stepped out of official party line and into the media, said that in his personal capacity he supported the UBI.
Right.
But the ANC's response at that point in time was that to give an able-bodied person a grant would be to undermine their dignity. So instead you needed to exact sweat equity through public works. And so that's kind of was the official line, that social protection through public works. Right. Now, the problem is that public works is a policy solution for emergencies. So if you look across the globe, if there is a war, if there's any kind of interruption, you use public works as a kind of to mop up additional labor for 3 to 6 months. Here, it needs to be a permanent solution for the 12.3 million adults who are not employed. And it can't be. There's absolutely no way it can be. And then the proposal went quiet for a long time. I've been part of a NEDLAC social security task team, which has it was sitting for about 12 years, and it eventually came up with a green paper in 2021, which was very similar to the Taylor report, recommending a national social security fund, contributions, and the possible adoption of a UBI, Universal Basic Income. And that green paper was released, and after 10 days it was withdrawn. And we sit in a stasis where there is no policy direction going. That's
interesting, because I was looking for that green paper and I couldn't find it anywhere, and I was wondering what happened to it.
I asked the department recently about its status, and they said it was published, therefore it's in the public domain. The problem there was the pension fund. So as I hear it, and this is hearsay, was that the private retirement and pension fund sector were extremely irate about the proposals to nationalize industrial and private pensions, and put pressure on Cabinet to have it withdrawn. So that's I think really disturbing from a point of democratic engagement, because we're looking at future policy alignment for the country, and for one sector to have such a power and dominance to have it withdrawn, and debate silence was a problem. But you were asking about the proposal for UBI and BIG.
Yes, and in particular the details about how much you would see going to people. I know there are various modalities, but this is at the end of the day about putting income in people's hands. So what would that look like?
So just again to frame it, at SPY we did a project about 5 years ago with a number of other research organizations to identify what a decent standard of living would cost on a monthly basis. And we engage people in focus groups. So it's, again, quite a democratically defined standard.
Interesting.
And the monetary value of the aspects that go into a decent standard of living comes up to about 6,034 Rand per person per month. So that's the income level associated with people who live a decent standard of living. It's the median income. So just to sort of put that figure out there, national minimum wage is 4.3, so that's kind of down there. Grants are really at the bottom.
Very important point, because that's what it takes to subsist and I'm sure decent doesn't necessarily mean incredible. It's quite minimum,
basic,
really. Right.
So there are a number of different proposals on the table for basic income, and just to say at SPY, we define a universal basic income as a monetary payment that goes to every person without a condition, and to the individual, not to the household. So money going to everyone without a test for your income or anything like that. And you don't have to prove, you don't have to do anything with it, because often the World Bank's cash transfer programs come in with conditions, which we feel are very paternalistic.
Makes sense, because also you cut out the whole bureaucracy of having to figure out whether this person qualifies and doesn't.
The costs aspects of sort of checking on the means testing. Also, a lot of people who need the income but might be in a grey area just above it, in effect become criminalized, because if you are trying to cheat the means test because you need the money, that means that you're breaking the law. And there's a whole theory about kinds of policies that encourage criminalization and what that means for social cohesion and the rule of law.
Interesting.
So the term basic income itself has become appropriated by certain sectors within government who use it to refer to small means-tested unemployment grants, for instance. They talk about basic income and then everybody kind of relaxes. So the idea that we have is that a universal basic income needs to be enough to not just meet basic needs, but to actually transform and stimulate and catalyze a bottom-up economic revolution. And so from the econometric modeling that we've done, we've located it at the same amount as the upper bound poverty level. So we've got 3 poverty lines in South Africa. We've got the minimalist food poverty, the lower bound, and the upper bound. So the upper bound poverty line has just in the last few weeks been uprated to 1,663 Rand. It was 1,500 for a long time. So a lot of our demands are based on the 1,500. But, and the reason for us why that's so significant is inherent in cash flow is a multiplier. So if I get 350 Rand as a child support grant, that money doesn't disappear. I use it to buy bread, to support the local services and goods that are around me, to pay the taxi driver for me to sort of take the kid to school, etc. And that multiplier is significant because for in a lot of policy debates, it's been taken out of the equation. Now, we've been working with the Brazilian University of Sao Paulo, who've just last year completed a 42-country study of that multiplier and found that in countries of higher income inequality like South Africa, that multiplier can be of the magnitude of 6 or 7 times.
Wow.
So the growth potential in distributing sufficient income means that, and the calculations that we've done, the decent UBI to everybody under 60, so we keep the old age pension out of it, could be 96% self-financing. So not only could it almost pay for itself, it could also generate GDP of about 5.6% per annum. I mean, right now we can't even make 1%.
Yeah, 1% would be lovely.
And it can create 2 million decent permanent jobs in the first 3 years. So for us, the actual amount and how it gets rolled out is significant. So the first year we would equate it to the food poverty line, which is about 760. The second year to the lower bound poverty line, which is now about 1.1. And then the third year would be the upper bound poverty line. And that's important because we're wanting to we're wanting to roll with the stimulus. So each time you inject money into the economy, you get a certain level of stimulus. But that has to be sustained for it to become entrenched. So that for us would be the significant sweet spot of the economic stimulus.
So just to see if I have this right, so there are 3 levels of poverty. The first is literally the minimum food you can eat, and you need about 762 Rand for that. And then there's a intermediate, and then there's the upper bound poverty line, which is really, apart from food, all the things you need to effectively eke out an existence. And you're suggesting that we pay South Africans that amount every month. Everyone qualifies. Of course, later we'll discover not everyone will opt in because they won't need to. But everyone gets the minimum amount for the upper bound poverty line, and that's the proposal.
That's the proposal, which means that we solve poverty overnight. It's the kind of a fairy tale solution. If you pay that amount, you take everybody above poverty. People say, but why would middle class people get it?
Let's go into this because you know the argument. How come a billionaire would get this? Isn't it better if we just focus on those who are below a certain income threshold? Why is it more efficient to just open the criteria to everyone?
And the solution is that there still is a means test, but it's an inverted means test. So we use SARS and the tax system to claw it back from people who earn above the income tax threshold.
I see. I see.
And that could be adjusted in order to ensure that the full value is clawed back. But what globally the research has shown is that the most vulnerable people in means-tested, targeted systems just don't have the wherewithal often to negotiate the obstacles to proving their eligibility. And here in South Africa, you've got people in rural areas who are not able to. You've also got children whose parents can't prove on the birth certificate.
Yeah.
But if the assumption is that and we can say legal resident is entitled to it, and it gets clawed back. There are so many benefits. Firstly, as you mentioned, the cost of SASSA and the administration is reduced. In addition to that, you have the ability to ensure that children in early childhood development receive it, because a lot of mothers struggle to get the child support granted to prove all of that. And so the first 2 years where good nutrition is required is taken out of the system. It's also beneficial because currently the means test, and this is something which I sort of struggled talking to the Ministry of Finance about. The Minister of Finance will say that grants create dependency. I say, no, targeting creates dependency. And I did some qualitative research up in Mpumalanga just after the 350 grant was introduced, and spoke to a builder who'd lost his job in Joburg, moved back home. And because he was getting the 350, he was able to get credit from the hardware store. And so he got cement and bricks. And so he operated a small business, based on the credit because of the reliability of the cash promise from the state. Because SASSA has draconian laws and powers that middle-class people would object to, they go into every person's bank account, and they saw that this person was earning sort of in dribs and drabs, small amounts. And so he immediately lost the 350 grant. He took me to a house which he said will never be completed because he is no longer able to get that. And so means testing creates a disincentive to anyone to use that money in a developmental way in order to generate more money. Now, that is taken out of the picture. In fact, it becomes you're no longer penalized for using that. There are just a number of ways in which that level of transfer of cash into the economy, economists can start relying on that and looking at financial modeling around that. So the benefits are extraordinary, and it gets clawed back, as I said, from middle income people. We know because it's universal that it's reaching every person. I was having a debate with a number of people over the last, I think it was, at the beginning of the Government of National Unity. There was concern about the levels of poverty, and one of the solutions, profit, was to increase VAT exemption on a number of goods.
Right.
And basically that doesn't make sense because the very poor people buy from shops that don't charge VAT. The kinds of goods that were pushed as being ones that should be VAT exempt. It was clear that there was industry lobbying behind. It was a very blunt policy response. And that's the point about the universal aspect of a basic income, is it actually fits the problems that we have. When people talk about small businesses and encouraging small businesses, absolutely. But if you are selling vegetables or selling services in a township where people have no disposable income, you're going to fail because there's no market. So especially young entrepreneurs get really excited. They might go through an incubator program and set up business. And a lot of people from the work that we've done, they really want to work where they live. They want to contribute to the community. And yet after 2 or 3 months, their dreams are shattered. And they also are blacklisted. So the point about the income distribution is that it revolutionizes the distribution, the kinds of economic activity. And as I've said from the work that we've done, if it's at that significant level, it can become self-financing to sort of all bar 4%. But if you do too little, in terms of headcount and too small in terms of value. It will be what the Minister of Finance once said. He said, like, social grants you can see is just throwing money away. But that depends on your design, and your design depends on your ideology. If you're liberal in mind and you believe that a two-tier system is okay as long as you meet basic fundamentals, then that's what you're going for. If you look at a sort of inclusive social democracy where you believe that everybody should be entitled actually to the rights that the Constitution guarantees, then you're looking at something which has to be transformative and has to be larger than the problem itself.
It's fascinating, and one just doesn't understand why we're not getting more energetic, or government at least is not getting more energetic about this, because it's clear that we can't keep doing the same things and expecting different results and repackaging old plans as new plans. And this is a different proposal. Of course, one of the big objections, which you have already alluded to, is this idea of cost, that it would cost too much, we don't have money, it would expand government debt potentially. Talk us through the cost and indeed the financial rewards, because in the debate, as far as I'm seeing it, there's all this talk about cost and then no talk about the spillover effects, no talk about what money you get back into the economy through the multiplier, no talk about how this can influence growth. So how do you do the economic cost benefit analysis? Clearly, we're going to need some money from somewhere.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we just take out a big hole, from the fiscus. It actually finds its way back in other ways.
Yeah. One of the principles that we had in looking at the financing was to try not to look at increasing tax, because by taxation, it means you taking money out of the economy. And we recognize that businesses and individuals are struggling. So some proposals are tax-based. We're not opposed to the idea of wealth tax, because wealth is idle. It's lying there, gathering profits for fund managers overseas. So there's definitely something to look at there, but not as a primary funding. So, we're looking at a sort of an envelope cost of about 800 billion. That would be the cost of it. So it is a significant amount of money.
Sure.
But this is where to look at a comprehensive design is so important. Because we argue that children need to be brought in, you can discount the amount of the child support grant expenditure. Sure. And because you are looking at the fact that you're going to be generating additional revenue through VAT, as well as through income tax, because everything's going to be increased, we discount the levels of additional allocated funds. So it's not really significant new money. But you're right, saying there has to be an additional financing of it before the multiplier kicks in. And in that, we've looked at identifying surplus monies that exist. The Government Employee Pension Fund, as many people have pointed out, it's 100% funded. Now, in no situation will every single civil servant retire on the same day. That's the point. It's a pay-as-you-go. Other countries have pay-as-you-go. So there is an amount that can be taken from that because it's being put into the economy.
Sure. And reinvested. It's
exactly,
not as if it's being
with returns.
Social and economic.
And the Unemployment Insurance Fund itself, which ironically should be the first place that you look, has got, I think it's got about 100 billion in surplus, which could be, again, directed into a return of the social investment. But you mentioned earlier the kind of macroeconomic framework, and that is one of the challenges, is the current macroeconomic framework, the one that's been governing us for the last 30 years. It highlights debt and inflation. And so those are the things that are identified as being priorities. If, and this is what we argue as well, if the macroeconomic framework is changed to target unemployment and growth, then we can have a releasing of these funds in order to do that. So that would make it affordable. The question as to why it doesn't happen is an interesting one, because through NEDLAC and various other forums that we sit in, we put this proposal time and time again. And that objections are raised on all fronts, such as the affordability, dependency creating, etc., etc. And when we refute every single argument and say we need to get to the macroeconomic framework, we get told by every person that that's above my salary grade, can't do that. So there is a refusal to engage on that level of rethinking, of innovation, of doing things differently. And it's as if we are determined to keep on making the same mistakes.
Why do you think that is? And you've been into some of the most important boardrooms and decision-making structures in the country, from government to political parties to NEDLAC. What's behind our failure of imagination here?
I wake up every morning at 3:00 and ask myself the same question. Don't come up with a solid answer. To my understanding, some of it is path dependency, that policymakers are nervous about taking on a new direction and would rather just repeat what their predecessors had to do. I mean, they retire with their pension at the end of the day, from the government employee pension fund. But there is also, I think there's a strong ideological component to it. The fact is that when you look at when South Africa became a democratic republic, I mean, that was at the end of the Cold War. So the kind of the winning ideology was a neoliberal ideology from the West, or from the US particularly. And the contestation of ideas from a communist or sort of socialist idea were defeated under the defeat of communism. Now, you and I know that socialism and communism are not the same idea. But you have the emergence of a dominant neoliberal policy, which said that the market, leave the market alone. The invisible hand of the market will determine and will allocate, and that'll be fair. And I mean, that really is the big problem, because the market doesn't care. If we look at the loss of jobs from the private sector, the private sector is not creating jobs. There is no stabilizer, which is what the state does. The state stabilizes in a social democracy. And this is why the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, are strong economically, because there is no embarrassment about the fact that there is a regulation of capital, and, or as the trade unions say, a disciplining of capital, and that gets put back in. But I mean, I have briefed. In fact, before the elections, we engaged with a number of the competing political parties.
What was the response?
It was distressing to me.
Wow.
How little people who were hoping to kind of win the elections had thought about the economy at all, and about the impediments to growth, and about the distribution of income and surplus and wealth, and about future trajectories, about how to shape in a very conscious way the kind of party that you wanted. I also think the absence of ideology was distressing. So I engaged with some younger members of newly emerging parties and asked them what their ideology was. And when I asked them to define why they thought they were, there was no ability to do so. So some people said that their party was social democratic. And I said, well, then what is your view on a wealth tax? And they said, oh, no, we don't want to tax wealth. So, so, I mean, ideology we need to define. We need to say, what kind of society do we want? If we want an egalitarian society, that means that we have to have redistribution, both in accumulated apartheid wealth, but also subsequently generated wealth. We need to look at the elite political influence as well as the private sector influence, and see how that is disciplined, and then also how that contributes to upliftment. We need to see to what extent we want the basic level of survival to be. And again, this brings in, what is your basic floor? Is it 1,500 or is it zero? And I mean, I think the extent of, and I speak on my own behalf, as a South African. I'm terrified of numbers. I'm a lawyer. I can talk to you about law. When it comes to economics, many of us were schooled, whether it was state or private school, by teachers who also were not familiar with numbers. So when I've engaged with parts of the ruling party, sort of at a decision-making level, and made the arguments, there is a reluctance to engage on the numbers. So if someone says it's not affordable, then people will say it's not affordable. When you say it's affordable if you do this and that and that and that, there is a disempowerment about embracing and owning the figures. So I think that that's one thing that we really need to see is going back to figures. I mean, I was in another setting, and I was talking about the unemployment levels, and people were like, yeah. And then I did a comparison with countries that had similar, where the next layer of unemployment levels came in. And a cabinet member stopped and said, but that's shocking. And I said, yes, that is shocking, absolutely shocking. And so what we also, and just going back again to why the idea of a universal basic income is a significant change, a significant departure.
Absolutely.
A number of countries have got pilots ongoing, but that's more at a sort of sub-state level. But the problem is that what we were saying at the beginning, I mean, the levels of our dysfunction are so absolute that we have to have a solution that is larger than the problem. But if we don't look at the sort of true situation, we can delude ourselves as to what's required. And so we look at solutions. We look at public works programs that are being done in the US, where they have an unemployment rate that's below 10%. And that's another thing. We have two unemployment rates that are used in this country. We have the official unemployment rate, which is about 32, 33%, and we have the expanded definition, which is 42.6%. The difference is that the official unemployment rate refuses to count unemployed people who've given up looking for work. So my debate is, well, you can't be unemployed and unemployed at the same time. You either are employed or you're unemployed. And if you are creating solutions to a 32% unemployment rate or solutions to a 42% unemployment rate, they're going to be different. The cost signifiers are going to be different. But we're heading towards a situation where half of all adults are not employed. And the reason why that's so significant is we're losing skills as people retire, which are not coming in. I mean, 15 to 24-year-olds, we've got an unemployment rate of 72%.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch, and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. I mean, it's just eye-watering, really.
And more than 3/4 of the unemployed are in long-term unemployment, which means that statistically they will not become employed again.
This is actually an interesting point about the Universal Basic Income grant, because I saw some work done by Youth Capital about just the cost of looking for a job.
Yeah.
So far from this replacing jobs and making the economy less productive, their argument is that actually when we give this financial power to people, we enable them to go and look for employment and not have to incur so much cost in just the pure search.
Absolutely. And that research came up with a figure around 1,000 Rand is the monthly cost for a young person to look for a job. And that's look for a job in a labor market where they're likely to not succeed because jobs have been shed. I mean, again, that's not new information. In 2002, 2003, an organization called EPRI, the Economic Policy Research Institute, did initial findings of households that received the child support grant and found that instead of the grants acting as a disincentive to people to look for work, those households that received it were more likely to go out and look for a job. Because, I mean, there was an eloquent line used by the director, Michael Sampson, who said, if you got last 10 Rand, are you going to use it to take a taxi to look for a job that you don't know you have a return on? Or are you going to use it to buy bread tomorrow? And that is why the significance of a guaranteed income, notwithstanding your condition, is so important. There's a Nobel laureate, Amajit Banerjee, who is
economics and all of that.
Yeah, that's right. And Esther Duflo. They are associated with Kenyan UBI pilots called Give Directly. And they were looking at 3 different situations. Often people say if you give people money, they'll chow it. You must enable them to purchase assets. So one of the trials was an asset transfer, so enough to buy an asset. I think it was $2,000 a once-off. The second was a 2-year income distribution, so UBI.
Right.
And the third was I think it was 12-year, but simulating permanent. And the second one, there were some conditions that people had to use the money to look for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. The finding was that the asset, the lump sum that was given over was basically chowed, because people said that they had no guarantee that there was going to be a better future. So rather sort of, and it was, it just sort of, it melted away. The 2-year one, people used the money, but they used it really for consumption. So we know that for 2 years, we're going to have more income coming in. So let's eat more. And the third, which was the basic permanent pilot, the finding that they have is that much less was consumed and more was put into sending kids to school because they use their fees in Kenya. And in addition to that, investing in small business creation. Those are the kinds of solutions that we want to find. But I also want to talk about the mental well-being, because too frequently, even progressives in countries like ours are fixated by, is this going to create employment? And you can understand why, because unemployment is the big nightmare.
Sure.
But in a number of the pilots across the globe, one of the biggest findings is people's happiness. People's emotional and mental well-being has improved. And that reminds me of one of the findings of the NIDS CRAM survey, which was done during the lockdown, the COVID lockdown. Because there was more money going in through the child support grant, for the first 6 months, there was a caregiver's grant as well as top-up of grants and the social relief of distress. And in that 6-month period, we effectively solved poverty through cash transfers. And the mental well-being of women increased dramatically. The anxiety, the depression. And we know that when people's mental well-being is under pressure, you can't make good decisions. You can't actually plan in a rational way, because you are constantly under survivalist attack. It's about where's tomorrow's food coming from. When that is affected, when people are relieved of that burden, the ability to plan better, but the ability to live better is significant. I was involved, Namibia, there was a UBI pilot about 2010 till 2014, and I went and did 2 reviews and evaluations of it. And at the beginning and then sort of at the end. And at the end, I went and I was speaking to a woman. So what they did was they paid everyone the equivalent of 100 Rand. It was $100 million in a place called Oratile, which was a village in the desert where mostly German farmers had dumped farm workers who they no longer needed for mechanization purposes. And so it was an incredibly non-productive area, people living. And so it was selected because it was a closed sort of research field, if you want to say. And one woman I went back to, and she bought a TV and in those days a video machine. So with my middle-class prejudice, I thought, oh, okay, so this is what happens. People just want to watch TV. I mean, I'm so embarrassed about my response. I said to her, so how does this add? She said, I charge my neighbors 50 cents a night to come and watch movies. And And that's the point, is you don't have to teach poor people how to make money. It's just you need to enable them, give them that ability.
Right,
So
right.
if the neighbors didn't have their UBI, they couldn't have afforded to pay that amount on a nightly basis to her. So you have to have that circular economy. And there was an old woman, she lived on her own, and she planted some orange trees, which is an amazing feat in the desert, but she also had some really weird looking plants. They looked like a sort of alien. And I asked her about those, and she just said to me, for the first time in my life, I can have something beautiful. And that's why I do it. I mean, I still get goosebumps when I think she had a sort of duck over her head and sort of very small, mean house. But she said, now I have things of beauty. And how, in a constitutional democracy that rates dignity as one of the sort of overarching principles, can we not aspire that is what our policy should be achieving, is that people can have dignity and beauty in their lives, and it's not just a survivalist struggle?
Well, Isobel Frye, thank you so much for joining us to unpack the goal and dream of a universal basic income. You've certainly helped to enlighten the audience as to its wisdom and its feasibility, and here's hoping this conversation travels to the right places.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for watching, and like, share, subscribe, help us get to 150,000 subscribers by the end of this month. What are your thoughts? Let's debate down below and engage. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And have you changed your mind on the importance of a universal basic income for South Africa? Stay tuned to SMWX, and we'll see you on the next one. Aye.